One of the reasons they're called forever chemicals is not just because they stay in the environment forever, but also because they stay in our bodies too. That's exactly how these chemicals work, is it's like the tiny amounts that ultimately have the biggest impacts. The reason that these chemicals are legal is because we do know for a fact that the chemicals interact with each other, and when they do, they can have compounding effects. Black women have much higher body burdens of EDCs than white women do. I think it's important for people to know and to make like an informed decision. Just promise me that you won't microwave your plastic Tupperware. That's what I want.
You guys are going to love today's guest because she's one of the leading voices helping us understand how the products we use every single day can quietly influence our hormones and health. She earned her PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Texas at Austin and is currently a postdoc researcher in Dr. Andrea Gore's lab at UT Austin, one of the most well-known research labs studying endocrine disruption and hormone signaling. Her research focuses on how synthetic compounds, whether from our environment or hormonal contraceptives, can mimic our natural hormones, affecting systems tied to mood, attention, learning, and overall health. She's also the founder of Endocrine.org, an incredible educational platform that helps us identify endocrine-disrupting chemicals in our own products and understand how these chemicals interact with multiple systems in the body. In today's episode, we're breaking down what EDCs are, where they're hiding, and why they matter, without fear-mongering and with a whole lot of science-backed clarity. Dr. Emily Hilz, welcome to Wellness Big Sis, the pod. Can you explain what are endocrine disrupting chemicals? Where can we find them in our everyday environment and everyday products?
Absolutely. This is definitely where my expertise has developed in its fullest, and that would be endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, which are defined as any exogenous, which means coming from outside the body, chemical that interferes with any aspect of hormone action. And then an important part of that is and results in an adverse health outcome. So two main components there is it's structurally similar to the body's endogenous hormones, but it's coming from outside of the body. And then it is having an unintentional impact on health in a negative way, which is why they're different from something like hormonal birth control, which is, yes, exogenous, but it's designed to impact the endocrine system purposely and doesn't cause cancer.
So what are some of the systems in our body that EDCs affect? And I know there's probably a multitude, but what are all of those systems? And then also zoom in specifically on the brain, because I feel like that's probably where a lot of your research is how do EDCs affect our body as a whole, but then more specifically, how does it affect our brains?
I think you also asked where do they come from.
Oh,
That's
yes.
just there are several main classes. There's the bisphenols, the phthalates, perfluorinated chemicals or PFAS, which have been popularized as quote unquote forever chemicals, parabens, and flame retardants are five major classes of EDCs. And then these chemicals are all either estrogenically or anti-androgenically active. They could be anti-estrogen or like not pro-estrogen isn't really a word. So they are either anti-estrogenic or androgenic or a combination of the two. And the reason that they are this way is because they're structurally similar to our body's endogenous hormones. They can be found in plastics, personal care products. Phthalates are used as emulsifiers in fragrance. Parabens are used in products to increase shelf life and as antimicrobials. Bisphenols are used in a lot of food packaging. They're also found in plastics. Perfluorinated chemicals, or PFAS, are non-stick chemicals, which they could be found in non-stick cookware, but they can also be found in clothing and fast food wrappers. Anything that's designed to be oil slick, non-stick tends to have it. Flame retardants are found in a lot of furniture, synthetic fibers and stuff. To give that little overview real quick, because I think it's important.
It's helpful for
But
me as someone who just has no expertise on this subject at all, but who heard of things like forever chemicals and is constantly targeted with these ads for cookware that is, no PFAS in it or whatever. I had never heard of this diagram in the way that you explained it of like, okay, these are the ones that you need to watch out for and where they might be found. So no, very, very helpful.
it's interesting because I do think just in the relatively short amount of time that I've been studying endocrine disruptors, I feel like they have blown up. When I started studying them, I didn't even originally know what they were. Like I went into the lab and I was like, yeah, sure, okay, endocrine disruptors. And then I was like, wow, these are in everything. I didn't know this. People don't know this, do they? And then 4 years later, 5 years later, here we are. And I feel like it's everywhere. So that's actually very cool to me as a scientist and somebody who is at the intersection of science and policy to see in real time something that has been being studied for 40 or 50 years now. The first popularization of the idea of endocrine disruptors was actually the book Silent Spring, if you're familiar. Pesticides are the other huge category of endocrine disruptors. Sorry, forgot to mention that one. Agricultural products. Was Silent Spring back in the 1970s. And so we've known about them for a long time, but the fact that they're in so much of our daily use products is new and only really starting to enter the cultural consciousness, I think.
And speaking of their effects on our bodies and on our brains, do they mimic some of the receptors that estrogen might have, or dopamine, or any sort of neuromodulator or chemical within our brain that is supposed to be there and normal and has that positive outcome? How do they actually change our brains and our bodies and different systems within our bodies from like a very basic physiological level, I guess, but then also just a general, like what might people also notice within their bodies from more of a basic level?
I think how I'm going to answer this is not necessarily what people want to hear, but
Okay.
I'm going to talk about it anyways. So we have to keep in mind that our exposures, they're happening now, but they've been happening for 70 years. So like your grandma at one point had your mother inside her and you were inside your mother. And so we have all of this generational exposure that rewrites our DNA essentially and the way that we're developing. So I feel like in some ways, people ask me, like, what would you notice? And I'm like, I don't know if you would notice because I feel like it's just who you are. Like, did you feel like maybe you struggle to be as motivated as your parents or like struggle with attention or things like that? It might not be like a before and after as opposed to just this is what it's like now, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like
no,
it's changed the way we're developing as people,
it's
as a
the state
species.
the state that we find ourselves in again too. Like you said earlier, is like that's I also love that y'all do study this generational impact because I didn't really even think about it until I was actually reading some of y'all's research and learning about what y'all were researching. I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of crazy that, these, like they call them forever chemicals, it's not just me that they're affecting, but they're affecting the generations after me. And it's not just me and what I'm exposed to now, but what the generations before me were also exposed to.
Yeah, one of the reasons they're called forever chemicals is not just because they stay in the environment forever, but also because they stay in our bodies too. This is a problem I feel like with EDC awareness that I run into a lot is people get a little defeated feeling because it's overwhelming. Okay, what doesn't have some kind of harmful chemical in it? And the answer to that is plenty of things. And certainly we're also working towards improvement is always a positive thing. We might not be able to rewrite history, but we can try to affect the future. So even if it stops with me or something, we could definitely improve outcomes in that way. But our ancestral exposures are something to think about for sure. And that is where a lot of my research is. Like I do study direct exposures and intergenerational. We'll rewind a little bit and get back to your question on the biochemical processes of how these chemicals are endocrinologically active. And you hit the nail on the head when you were mentioning their binding to receptors. Essentially, we have estrogen and androgen receptors in many of our different tissues, and they work in different ways in the brain. The point being is an EDC would have a binding affinity, which is the ability to bind a receptor competitively with our own hormone levels. And some chemicals have higher binding affinity than our normal or our endogenous hormones, and then others have lower binding affinity. What that basically means is, can the chemical that you're being exposed to essentially beat the estrogen and take over your receptor to affect it? And a lot of them can't. This is a misguided notion in toxicology, thinking that if a chemical cannot competitively bind the receptor, then we don't have any reason to be concerned about it. But what that fails to account for is the idea of developmental periods. So I have a lot more estrogen than a baby does, or a fetus. And so something that might not competitively bind in me can definitely competitively bind in a developing fetus or in a child or in a woman who's going through perimenopause. We're talking about women right now, but to be totally transparent, this is extremely relevant for men. Actually, I see a lot more adverse effects in my male rats than I do in my females. They seem to be like a lot more physiologically sensitive to EDCs. And it's specifically when they're exposed in utero, or we do what's called perinatal exposure. So they're exposed in utero and then neonatally. So, like, equivalent to when you're pregnant and then the first few years of life. And during that time, estrogens in the mother's body organize the development of the child's brain and body. And exposure to synthetic hormone mimics during that time can competitively bind developing receptors and change the way they function, change the way that the brain is organized, ultimately leading to a long-term change in the total development of that being.
These can happen topically or like orally or like with sniff. Like, how do they get in the body? It can happen across all sorts of barriers in the mom's body and affect the developing baby.
I would say that oral exposure tends to be the best studied and probably the most direct route. I think topical is a really important thing to talk about because a lot of the cultural concern is around personal care products that are used topically. And the thing with topical is I don't like a lot of them do not permeate the skin. We do get these residues on us that are going to get into our mouths and open wounds. There's plenty of ways for something that you're only using topically to get into your body. And even though it's such a small amount, that's exactly how these chemicals work. Is it's like the tiny amounts that ultimately have the biggest impacts.
It's interesting too. And like you said, probably very hard to study all of the different effects, but I hadn't ever thought of the, I guess, competing nature of EDCs against not only estrogen, but other hormones within our bodies. I'm sure it affects all of those things too, but very, very interesting. So I know you've also not only just like studied in the lab, but you've created Endocrine.org as a way to sort of bridge that gap from research and what you guys are studying in the lab to the everyday person like me, building a resource to help people like me figure out what EDCs are in our products and in our environments and what we're exposed to. So explain a little bit about Endocrine.org, why you created it, and how you would like it to be utilized in our lives, how you use it.
Yeah, so Endoscreen is a passion project, really took off. It's not very heavily used or anything, but it got a lot more attention than I was ever expecting it to. And what it is, it's an EDC scanner web app. So it's not available on app stores, it's just a website. I wanted it to be that because there's a lot of me in Endoscreen, and I'm somebody who doesn't like having to download it. So I made it a website, but it works on both Android and iPhone. It's a little more complicated on iPhone. And what it is, a scanner app that you can use to take pictures of product ingredient labels. And this is really for personal care products. It doesn't work for food or things like that. It's for ingredient lists of shampoo, soap, a lot of stuff you'd find in your bathroom. And it reads the label and compares it to a database that I put together that I built on top of previously existing databases. So I took the most recent databases that were available and then fine-tuned them to be very human and health specific, and then gathered all of the most recent research that I could find. And so what it does is it reads the label, compares it to the database, detects any known endocrine disruptors, and then essentially gives you a report back. So if there's no EDCs, it just says no EDCs, you're great. But if it does detect something that's in our database, it will tell you what the chemical is in terms of its name, the known adverse health impacts of it, like across systems. So it'll be like this chemical is associated with reproductive impacts or neurodevelopmental disorders or cancer. And then if you click on that, it'll give you a drop down list, and it actually shows you with links to the research articles, that association. And I also wanted to include a little bit of certainty, because that's a thing with studying EDCs. You want people to know, okay, this chemical has 3 research articles that link it with an adverse health effect. That's not a lot versus something like BPA that has 2,000 research articles linking it with adverse health impacts in humans and rodents, because that's what's in the database, human research or rodent research, because rodents are so translatable to humans. That's where we do most of our preclinical research. So yeah, I wanted to get that certainty in there so that you could say, okay, this one doesn't have a lot of research, maybe I don't need to be so concerned about it. Or, hey, this one's got a ton of research across a whole host of things. That's something I should be more concerned about.
That's why I love that you created it, because I feel like you are in the lab, you're doing the research, because as I said, I get a lot of the marketing material, like I'm like an advertiser dream when it comes to non-toxic things. And I'm like, well, I would really like to learn this from someone who is actually like in the lab researching this, because like you said, if there's 3 studies, it's like, okay, hang on, how, is this a major concern, or can we be a little bit more human about it too? Not just think, oh my gosh, it's so negative for my health. And I have played around on endocrine.org. I tried it with some of my personal care products, and I just got it was a good product, I guess, and had a good label on it, which I was excited about. But I loved the pie chart that you had on there of the systems that EDCs affect. And it was super fascinating to see that reproductive had just like probably the largest part of the pie chart on it. I think it was under the learn or the health tab or one of those tabs, but I was like, oh my gosh, reproductive. If you guys go take a look, check it out. I'll leave the link below because it's great for your products. And like she said, it's browser based. So you don't have to download another app, which is great. And my husband loves that too. So he's always like, I don't know why people always think they need to create apps. We need more browsers in this world. So it's funny. The tech people also agree with you too. But yeah, I played around with it, and I think it's definitely worth a good chunk of time, just sort of like going through it and seeing all of the research surrounding it and little drop-down menus on like, what can we do if it's in our cookware? Or she has like helpful tips and tricks on there too. So it's not just like the product scanner, which is very, very helpful, but it's also got all the studies and the research surrounding it too. So I loved it. I've loved using it so far for the last little bit, looking up like just different personal care products, but I haven't found one that has given me the report yet. So I'm going to have to keep searching, because I know I have one. One of my products, my routine probably has it. So I need to do it for all of them.
Yeah, I will say Endoscreen really gives me like old school internet vibes in a lot of ways. And that's because I made it myself. I had a lot of help from some of my software engineer friends, but I did a lot of the front end. And I think that's a strength. But in some ways, it is not necessarily as accessible as it could be, because it's just, hi, I'm a neuroscientist, and here's like a bunch of NIH studies connecting this chemical with this outcome. It's not entirely the most digestible thing. It's got a little bit of a hurdle to use, but once it gets working, it works great, I think. And it's just very no frill, science forward. I wasn't trying to influence people's opinions. I just wanted them to have information when I made it. So
You
that's
get
what it
that.
does.
It reads that way. And I will say, when you said, I forget the words you used to describe it, but basically not the most tech forward platform, and like being, what did you say? Like old 2000s based computer. Like it is a little bit nostalgic, and I actually really like that. So I liked using it that way. I liked logging on and being like, oh my gosh, wait, this is so simple as a user to use. So I loved it. When talking about EDCs, are there certain like safe, unsafe levels that we should watch out for? And I'm sure it's very like compound chemical dependent, but are there truly like safe or unsafe levels of EDC exposure?
No, that's the short answer. But also, yes, again, something we've been talking about a lot in this episode is the idea of sensitive periods of development, where what is harmful at one age or in one sex might not be harmful at a different age or at a different sex. But saying something that might not be at a harmful level for me would be for a child. But going to just like levels of exposure, the reason that these chemicals are legal is because based on standard toxicological testing, they're not harmful toxicologically, which means they don't kill cells. But those hazard assessments don't really look at endocrine mediated outcomes, and they're designed for like immediate outcomes. So they don't incorporate ideas about the long term effects of, okay, the exposure happened at this point in time, and then years and years later is when you see the development of an adverse health effect. That's canonical EDC, is this long latency period between exposure and harmful health impacts, specifically because the latency tends to be you get exposed as a developing fetus, and then you start seeing impacts probably around puberty when you start going through activational sex differences into adulthood. So recommendations for safe exposure levels, but those recommendations are mostly for adults, and they're for like direct toxicology, like toxicological outcomes. So I guess the answer is yes and no based on our FDA health recommendations. Absolutely. And I'm not in a position to fully challenge that, except to say that there's all this research at levels below the doses that have been tested for these chemicals that prove that they are harmful below the levels that we're told they're safe at. And then another thing to think about in that context is that all of these chemicals, the ones that we tested, which is only a small number of chemicals that are even available or being produced, are being tested in isolation. So they're only looking at one chemical, but we're not exposed to anything in isolation. So we do know for a fact that the chemicals interact with each other. And when they do, they can have compounding effects. So even if you are maybe being exposed at a safe level to one thing, you also have 6 other chemicals at any one time in any one product, which kind of creates just like a physiological state of exposure that has long-term physiological implications that aren't being addressed right now by our current regulatory recommendations.
I think what you're repeating is well worth repeating, because for me, I had no idea, even thinking about, the differences between like ages or our developmental stages. It's like, oh, I never even thought about this, like, I guess, competitive affinity for certain endogenous hormones that are naturally occurring within our bodies versus these exogenous, endocrine disrupting chemicals that might come in too. And I'm picturing like a little competitive race, right? But like you said, for children and for babies, and they might be more susceptible to them. And same with, later on in life when things start to shift and change. So I think that is well worth repeating, because that's something that I'm definitely taking from this episode as something that just to be a little bit more aware about, because I had never even thought about it. And it's cool to also hear, I guess, room for research growth. There's always going to be more to learn about the human body, and thinking about, okay, first we probably do have to study in isolation, but then thinking about all of these like compounding effects of all of them together is probably, next steps, because like you said, it's not in isolation. We're not exposed to them in isolation. So lots more to learn and figure out. I mean, like you said, it's 70 years ago was that book was written. So just thinking about the next 70 and where we'll be at that time too.
Yeah, right now my studies are using mixtures, and I was started out with an individual chemical that was weakly estrogenic, and to find some behavioral and neuromolecular impacts of exposure to that. And now I'm doing the mixture research, but it's hard because we're just guessing ultimately like what people are really being exposed to, what is like the most it changes by region, it changes by lifestyle, it changes by socio-demographic. Black women have much higher body burdens of EDCs than white women do. And a big part of that is because products that are advertised to them are like chock full of EDCs. So that's a difficulty in terms of just trying to come up with recommendations for people. And then also on the topic of safe levels of exposure, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about non-monotonic dose response curves. which is a mouthful, but basically what it means is not linear. And so when chemicals are safety tested, they're tested under the assumption that any chemical is going to have a linear effect on an adverse outcome. Let's say cell toxicity, like killing a cell. The idea would be that a low level will have less cell death than a high level, but hormones in general and EDCs specifically don't follow linear dose response curves, at least not all the time. If you work under the assumption that the effect is going to be linear, then you work under the assumption that there is a point at which there will be no effect. But I actually made a presentation about this. I want to say it was like 1,500 research articles showing that if you take a chemical and then reduce that level even more, like below the one that they didn't see an effect, then you start seeing effects again. And that's why it's non-monotonic, because it's almost like a V shape or like a bell curve or something where it's harmful, not harmful again, or it's just not a straight line. And that's why I would say that there's not really a safe level, because a lot of them just haven't been tested at every possible level in the first place. And a lot of times we like find a safe level and then go below it, and suddenly there's a new different impact.
That's very interesting too, because yeah, you definitely think linear. So I'm very, very glad you made that distinction, as probably a lot of us were thinking like the more exposure, the worse, the less exposure, the better. And that might not necessarily work out in every situation and might definitely not have been researched at every single possible level. So I am very
Maybe
glad.
we're just looking for a sweet spot.
Yeah, exactly. Finding the sweet spot. That's what the research is doing. So you mentioned earlier too how a lot of people can get discouraged on hearing about all of this information and thinking, safe versus unsafe levels. And now we've just said, let's not think of it on a linear curve where the less is better or anything. So what would you recommend, based on your research, ways that we can approach EDCs and EDC exposure healthily without getting so discouraged mentally with how much we are exposed to and the, I guess, lack of effort that we can put in to changing our state of our exposure from our great grandparents, way back when. So what are your recommendations for just approaching all of that?
One thing I will say is the idea of ancestral exposure. Actually, in another study that I published, we did like a 6th-generation rat research study, and we exposed the first generation, and then we waited 3 generations and we exposed them again. So it's called 2 hits, 3 generations apart. The goal was to show how like our ancestral exposures interact with modern chemical contaminants. And so the point of me mentioning that is that even though we can't change the past, like by reducing our exposure, we can still have a positive impact, because what we found was that the exposure history did interact with the current exposures to create future adverse impacts in offspring. We're not completely powerless in that regard. And then regarding just like thinking about things linearly, I would say that hormones and EDCs don't always have linear effects. That I would still say overall they're toxic compounds, which means that reducing your exposure is pretty much always going to be a positive. Dealing with the burnout is a question that's really worth addressing. And I think from that perspective, it's just like we are organic creatures that are living in a world that has always affected us in a lot of ways. If it wasn't chemicals now, it was like fire, smoke, and coal production 100 years ago. That's what human civilization is. And so I think it's just taking the information we get and slowly integrating it into our life and into our culture and just striving to do better. I still use products that I know have EDCs in them, but I think it's important for people to know and to make like an informed decision and say, okay, I love this shampoo, so I'm going to keep using it, but I don't really care about this body wash or hand soap, so I'm going to change that one out. And that's something we're working towards with Endoscreen. We are making a downloadable app I've given in. And with that one, we want people to be able to actually look up products and then add them to a routine to see how that specific product and the chemicals in it are to their weekly, monthly, yearly EDC exposure, and then make a decision like, okay, is this makeup or soap or body, whatever, worth the burden? Or if I remove it, how much does that reduce my body burden and things like that? I think that could be really motivating for people to see the actual impact one product could have on their long-term exposure level.
When is that coming out?
Good question. Software development's hard. I'm really hoping like January next year.
2027 or 2020?
Definitely 2026. It's almost done. We're just crossing the T's and dotting the I's, trying to put together a really big product database that people can search and get recommendations from.
I love that. And it'll have the routine ability right off the bat, or is that further on in the development process, I guess?
Yeah, it actually already has the routine ability. I think there's some ways that I'd like to improve it. Right now, it's just like a static thing, and I want people to be able to integrate how often they use the product to have that be represented as part of their routine. So we're still fine tuning. I would say we're like 75% of the way through the development process. And I am also a full-time researcher who's in the process of transitioning to starting my own lab. So it's slow, but it's just so cool that it's worth doing.
Well, I'm very excited about it. Consider me a early adopter of the app. If you let me know when it comes out. I'd love to test it out and be a part of that because I think it's super, super cool. Is there ways that we can support you in what you're doing or anything we can do to help what you're doing with Endoscreen or what you're doing in the lab?
If you use an Android, you can download our beta, which is really not fully functional yet, but it'll at least show you how it works. That's on the Play Store under Endoscreen. Or just check out the website and play around with it. Use it to scan some products. Maybe, what would help me is pick one thing that has EDCs in it and don't use it. or move to using glass, or just promise me that you won't microwave your plastic Tupperware. That's what I want.
A good one to end on, because I feel like it's the small habits too. Last year, one of my goals was to start decreasing toxicity within the products that I use, the way that I use things, whether it is plastic Tupperware in the microwave or whatever. And so I was very excited to get you on and learn from you today too. So I didn't tell you this either, but I am pretty good friends with people in the UT pharmacy program. And one of my best friends went there. His brother, his mom teaches there sometimes. And now their sister's going through the program. And so I had reached out to her and I was like, hey, do you know anyone who is in this lab? And she was like, is there anyone in particular? And I was like, I would really love to have Dr. Emily on the podcast if you happen to know her. And she didn't. But fortunately for me, you agreed and were so kind to come on and share your expertise, because I really resonated with what you were researching, and I knew a lot of people would. So you were, I guess, one of my primary people that I wanted her to hopefully eventually connect me with if she happened to know you, but she didn't. And that's okay, because you were so kind to agree to do this. But thank you so, so much for coming on, for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, Endoscreen with us, the plans for Endoscreen, because I'm super excited about that, and just all of the work you're doing in the lab, and I guess translating that to the general public. And hopefully this episode will help other people to also understand a little bit more about all of the different factors that go into play within our hormonal system and our brains and bodies and dopamine systems, and all of the things that I know are very hot topics right now that people really want to learn about from experts like yourself. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so much to cover, so little time, a lot of minutia, and always happy when people reach out to me with interest in learning about EDCs. And I mean that. You can always just Google me and send me an email and I'll talk to you.
It's the truth. That's exactly what I did. So I'm very, very appreciative. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I learned so much from you, and I know so many other people will too. But thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned so much from Dr. Emily, and I'll see you guys again in the next episode of Wellness Big Sis, the pod.